Hello, I'm presenting from Australia today, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the unceded land from where I'm recording this, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Today I'll be presenting our work on optimising an automatic creaky voice detection method for Australian English-speaking females, which is part of my PhD project. I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors and supervisors, Josh Penney, Andy Gibson, Anita Szakay, and Felicity. Creaky voice is generally perceived as a low-pitch, rough, or pulse-like voice quality. It is highlighted here in the spectrogram, where it is characterized by widely spaced vertical striations. Here are some examples of creaky voice in the speech of young Australian females, representative of the speakers used in the present study.
At that point, I turn left. Do I walk until I get to a 2-story house? I turn right.
Several different acoustic realizations of creaky voice have been documented in the literature. Realizations can be characterized by one or more acoustic properties such as low fundamental frequency or F0, high levels of glottal constriction, aperiodicity, or highly damped glottal pulses. In some languages, such as the Zapotec language spoken in Mexico, creaky voice is phonologically contrastive, and the addition of creak can change the meaning of a word from fish to snake, for example.
Fish.
Well.
Snake.
Well.
However, in English, creaky voice is non-contrastive. In English, creaky voice is frequently condemned by media and public discourse, especially in its association with the speech of young women. Here are some examples of media headlines that claim that young women should give it up, that it makes them sound babyish, that it's not okay, and even that it's vile. However, creaky voice has been suggested to have many prosodic functions in English, such as marking phrase finality, and sociolinguistic functions, such as conveying authoritativeness, genuineness, or even boredom. There is also evidence to suggest that creaky voice use varies depending on speaker background, such as speaker gender, ethnicity, or age. In their systematic literature review, Dallison and Doherty found that most studies of creaky voice have examined American English. They also found that creaky voice is generally manually identified using auditory or spectrographic auditory visual cues. Identifying creak in this way is time-consuming and labor-intensive and opens the door to human bias and inconsistencies between and within annotators. Automatic identification methods are one way of mitigating these issues and allow for research on big data sets. There are a number of automatic identification methods that have been proposed, a few of which are listed here. The Creak Detector algorithm developed by Drugman and colleagues is the focus of the present study. This tool uses an artificial neural network to make decisions about whether speech is creaky or not based on measurements of several acoustic cues such as those listed here. This tool has been widely used in studies of creaky voice. In previous work, we compared the output of Creak Detector with that of the anti-mode method, which is a low F0 based approach to identifying creak, and the union method, which was the combined output of the anti-mode method and Creak Detector as shown in this Venn diagram. Anything coded as creak by anti-mode or Creak Detector was counted as creak by the union method. This study used speech from Australian English-speaking males and females. We found that the union method performed the highest overall. We also found that limiting our analysis to sonorant-only segments significantly improved creaky voice detection compared to the inclusion of all available data in the analysis. In comparing these methods, we used the F1 score, The F1 score is based on this equation here, made up of true positives, false positives, and false negatives. It returns a score between 0 and 1. Higher scores indicate more accurate creak detection in relation to the manual annotator. In training the Creak Detector algorithm, Drugman and colleagues included read and conversational speech of 11 speakers of various language backgrounds. Creak Detector assigns a creak probability between 0 and 1 to each 10 millisecond interval of input speech, which is then converted into a binary creak decision based on the creak probability threshold. For example, if the creak probability threshold is set to 0.3, a 10 millisecond interval with a creak probability of higher than 0.3 will be coded as creaky voice, and any with a probability of less than 0.3 will be coded as not creaky. Drugman and colleagues found that the probability threshold that returned the highest F1 scores based on their input data was 0.3, which was set as the algorithm default. Merton and colleagues performed a similar probability threshold sweep with spontaneous speech data of 8 American English-speaking young females. They found the optimal threshold for their data to be 0.02, substantially different from the algorithm default of 0.3. Their findings are displayed here with creak probability threshold on the x-axis, performance on the y-axis, and F1 score shown by the solid black line. They showed the maximum F1 score of 0.549 was reached at threshold 0.02, while the F1 score at threshold 0.3 is only 0.326. In their study, Merton and colleagues used many different metrics to evaluate performance, but found the F1 score to be the most appropriate. In the present study, we aim to find the optimal creaky voice probability threshold for a corpus of female Australian English speakers. And also, based on findings from our previous work, we investigated whether the optimal probability threshold varied depending on whether the analysis included all available data or whether it was restricted to sonorants or vowels only. The data included in this study comprise of declarative sentences read by 38 native Australian English-speaking females aged 18 to 34. We chose 9 sentences common to both the AusTalk and AusVoices corpora, and the sentences ranged between 9 and 30 syllables. We processed them through mouse to force align them, and then phoneme boundaries were manually corrected. Each sentence was annotated for creaky voice and part by myself using auditory visual spectrographic cues. A subset of the sentences were also annotated by a second person and re-annotated by myself. An example of this annotation can be seen here. The highlighted tier shows intervals of manually identified creak. Inter and intra annotator agreement measures showed high levels of reliability. Each speaker's sentences were concatenated into one sound file before running through the Creak Detector algorithm 30 times. At each pass through the Creak Detector, the creak probability threshold was adjusted between 0.01 and 0.3 in increments of 0.01. This resulted in a total of 1,140 files. As I mentioned before, each 10 millisecond frame was assigned a probability of being creaky, which was converted into a binary creak decision depending on the threshold to which the algorithm was set. These binary decisions were then compared to the manual annotation, and each 10 millisecond frame was labelled as a true positive, true negative, false positive, or false negative. The first analysis we conducted compared the F1 scores at each threshold over all available data, sonorants only and vowels only. F1 scores were calculated across all speakers at each threshold. This plot shows a sweep for each run of data included. Threshold between 0.01 and 0.3 is on the x-axis, and F1 scores on the y-axis. We can see that the analysis, including sonorants only and vowels only, represented by the circles and triangles, pattern similarly to each other, and differ substantially from the analysis of all available data represented by the squares, which has lower F1 scores across all thresholds. Key stats from the previous plot are summarised here in this table, along with the equivalent findings from Merton and colleagues. Our optimal threshold of 0.18 for all available data is again very different from that of Merton and colleagues, who also ran their analysis over all available data. Our peak F1 score is only slightly higher. Our analyses that included only sonorant segments and only vowel segments resulted in very similar optimal thresholds and comparable peak F1 scores. We decided to focus on comparing all available data analysis to sonorant-only data for the rest of the paper, as although performance was slightly higher on vowels only, the differences are not large, and limiting the analysis to vowels only would probably exclude some instances of creaky voice. Taking the optimal thresholds from the all data and sonorant only sweeps, F1 scores were calculated for each speaker at these two thresholds. F1 scores for each speaker are shown by the small grey lines on the plot, with scores for the all data analysis at threshold 0.18 on the left, and scores for the sonorant only analysis at threshold 0.04 on the right. Means of these F1 scores are shown in the table. We can see that despite the differences in optimal thresholds between our all data sweep and Merton and colleagues, the mean F1 scores are similar. We also see that the mean F1 score for the sonorant only analysis is higher than for all data. We ran the following linear mixed effects regression model predicting F1 score by data included with speaker as a random intercept. The model output is shown by the larger black points on the plot. Results showed that F1 scores were significantly higher when analysis was limited to sonorant-only segments. Our results strengthen Merton and colleagues' finding that optimal thresholds of the Creak Detector algorithm differ between different corpora, even when both groups of speakers are young female speakers of English varieties. This suggests that the researchers using this tool may want to manually annotate a subset of their data and run a threshold sweep to find their own optimal threshold. We have also shown that if false alignment is available to the researcher, limiting analysis to sonorant-only segments can significantly improve automatic creaky voice detection. This annotated spectrogram illustrates this. Here we compare the outputs of Creak Detector run over all data with threshold 0.18 on Tier 3 and 0.04 on Tier 4 to the manual annotation on Tier 2 for a segment of speech. We can see that in both sweeps, Creak was identified during a non-speech interval, which is excluded in sonorant-only analysis. By lowering the threshold to 0.04, we capture Creak like this instance that would be missed otherwise. We also see that the 0.04 threshold captured Creak extending back into the voiceless fricative here. However, this false positive would not be included in a sonorant-only analysis. To conclude, it is important that studies of creaky voice are able to accurately reflect Creak use in different speaker populations. While the prospect of manually annotating creaky voice across large corpora may increase the appeal of automatic detection methods, it is important that these methods are optimized. We've shown two ways in which this can be achieved: through performing a threshold sweep on a subset of data, and by limiting analysis to sonorant segments. Thank you.
Anna? Buongiorno.